Marvel's Wolverine needs to prove something, not because it looks bad, but quite the opposite. Most people already expect it to be good, but what they don't know is whether it'll be special. Because for the first time in years, Insomniac isn't just making another Spider Man game, they're taking one of the most iconic characters in the Marvel universe and trying something very different with it. And after looking through the gameplay previews and community reactions, I think Marvel's Wolverine has become much more than just another superhero game. If Insomniac wanted to challenge themselves, they couldn't have picked a much better character to do so with Wolverine, in my opinion, because on the surface, Logan has all the ingredients you'd expect from a blockbuster superhero game. He's iconic, he's one of Marvel's most recognizable characters, and for decades, he's been one of the most popular members of the X-Men. But what makes Wolverine interesting isn't really his claws, it's everything that comes with him. Unlike Spider-Man, Wolverine has always occupied a more darker corner of the Marvel universe. He's violent, he's reckless, he's often driven by anger rather than his optimism. And many of his best stories aren't about saving the world, they're about survival, about loss and revenge, and the constant struggle to control the monster within him. That creates a very different foundation for a game. Spider-Man works because Peter Parker is inherently hopeful. Even at his lowest point, he remains the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man that we all recognize. But Wolverine isn't really built that way. He's rough around the edges, he makes mistakes, he loses control, and sometimes he solves problems with his fist before he even considers another option. That's exactly why so many fans were excited when Insomniac announced this project, not because they wanted another superhero game necessarily, but because Wolverine gives the opportunity to the studio to explore ideas that simply wouldn't fit with Spider-Man's story. A more mature tone, a more personal conflict, a more brutal combat, and a protagonist who isn't always trying to do the right thing. In many ways, Wolverine is a perfect character to just test how flexible Insomniac's approach to their storytelling and the game design really can become. Because if Spider-Man represented what the studio was already great at, Wolverine represents something else entirely. A chance to step outside their comfort zone, and based on what we've seen so far, I think that's exactly what they're trying to do. Of course, Wolverine comes with a challenge of its own expectations, and there are a lot of them. Not just because Wolverine is one of Marvel's most beloved characters, but because of who's making the game. Insomniac has spent the better part of the last decade building an incredible reputation. Spider-Man was a massive success. Miles Morales continued that momentum, and over time, Insomniac became one of PlayStation's most trusted studios, and that is a great position to be in. But it also changes how people look at your games because players no longer expect competence, they expect excellence. When a new Insomniac game is announced, the conversation isn't whether it'll be good, it's whether it'll be great. And Wolverine arrives with another layer of expectations on top of that. Marvel, the X-Men, and Logan himself. This isn't just some forgotten comic book character getting a surprise adaptation. This is Wolverine we're talking about. A character that has existed in comics, movies, television, and games for decades. Everyone already has an idea of who Wolverine is supposed to be, what he should sound like, how he should fight, how brutal he should be and feel as well. That's what makes this project so fascinating. Because Insomniac isn't just adapting any Wolverine, they're creating their own version of him, their own story, their own interpretation, their own place for him within the wider Marvel universe they've already built. And that's a difficult balancing act. Players want something familiar, but they also want something new. They want the Wolverine they already know. But that's also a reason for this game to exist. And somehow Insomniac has to satisfy both expectations at the same time, which is exactly why every piece of gameplay, every trailer, and every preview is being scrutinized so closely. Because people aren't just evaluating a new game, they're evaluating whether Insomniac can meet the enormous expectations that come with making a Wolverine game in the first place. When the gameplay reveal finally arrived, one thing immediately stood out: violence, and lots of it. Claws tearing through enemies, visible wounds, blood, brutal finishers, and a version of Wolverine that looked far more aggressive than anything Insomniac has ever made before. And unsurprisingly, that's what people mainly focused on. After all, Wolverine and brutality has always gone hand in hand. For years, fans have wanted a game that fully embraced how dangerous Logan can be, and based on what we've seen so far, Insomniac clearly understands that. But the more I looked into the gameplay, the more I realized something. The brutality isn't actually the most interesting part, because violence alone doesn't make Wolverine unique. What makes Wolverine interesting is the reason behind that violence. And unlike many superheroes, Logan isn't trying to become something better. He's trying not to become something worse. The rage, the guilt, the constant battle for control. Those are the things that have always defined the character. And that's where Marvel's Wolverine starts becoming much more interesting than a simple power fantasy. Because the gameplay reveal wasn't just showing gore, it was showing a character constantly on the edge. The rage meter, the aggressive combat, the relentless pace of encounters, everything appears to be built around the idea that Logan is dangerous not only to his enemies, but potentially to himself. And that creates opportunities that simply don't exist with a character like Spider-Man, because Spider-Man's stories are often about responsibility. Wolverine's stories are often about restraint. One character is trying to protect others, the other is trying to control himself. And that's a very different type of conflict. And if Insomniac can successfully build both the gameplay and the story around that idea, they might end up creating something much more memorable than simply a violent superhero game. Because at that point, the claws stop being the focus and Logan becomes the focus. And that's why I don't think Marvel Wolverine needs to prove that it'll be a good game, because most people already believe that. The gameplay looks promising, the visuals look fantastic, and Insomniac has earned a level of trust that very few studios enjoy. The real challenge is something else entirely. Marvel's Wolverine needs to prove that Insomniac can continue evolving, because success sometimes becomes a trap. The more successful a studio becomes, the easier it is to keep relying on the same strength. That is known as a competency trap, where you continue to rely on the things that you're good at, the same design philosophies, the same storytelling techniques, the same formulas that worked before. And to be fair, that's often what players want. When something works, people naturally want more of it. But growth rarely comes from repeating yourself. It comes from taking risks. It comes from exploring new opportunities, evolving your competences, turning it into something new entirely. And Wolverine feels exactly like that kind of risk. Of course, risks don't automatically lead to success. Some players already worry that the game could lean too heavily into cinematic storytelling. Others fear that beneath the brutality, it may still feel too familiar. And that's exactly why Wolverine matters so much. A more mature protagonist, a darker tone, a more focused and linear structure, a completely different emotional core. Everything we've seen so far suggests that Insomniac is deliberately moving into territory that feels very different from the games that made them famous. And that's why this project feels so important. Not because it's just another Marvel game, not because it's another PlayStation exclusive, but because it's one of the clearest opportunities Insomniac has had in years to show what else they're capable of creating. If Wolverine succeeds, players won't just remember it as a great Wolverine game. They'll remember it as proof that Insomniac can continue growing beyond the expectations that now surround the studio. And if it falls short, the conversation won't just be about Wolverine either. People will inevitably begin questioning whether Insomniac's greatest successes came from the characters they were given rather than the creative decisions they made. And that's a lot of weight for one game to carry, but that's also what makes Marvel's Wolverine so fascinating to watch. Of course, no one is convinced. Some players worry that beneath the gore and mature rating, Wolverine may still feel too familiar. Others question whether Insomniac can fully commit to the darker themes that made Logan such a compelling character. And that's a fair concern, because making a game more violent doesn't automatically make it more mature. That's something Marvel's Wolverine will ultimately have to prove itself for. At the end of the day, Marvel's Wolverine needs to convince people that it looks exciting. For most people, it already does. The combat looks brutal, the presentation looks impressive, and the world Insomniac is building appears full of potential. What makes this game so interesting isn't whether it'll be good, it's what success would actually mean. Because if Marvel's Wolverine lives up to the expectations surrounding it, it won't simply be remembered as another successful superhero game. It'll be remembered as proof that Insomniac can continue evolving, that the studio isn't defined by a single character, a single franchise, or a single formula. Instead, it would show that the qualities that made players trust Insomniac in the first place can be applied to something else entirely. And honestly, that's what I'm most interested in. Not whether Wolverine can be the next Spider-Man, but whether Wolverine can become the next Wolverine. Because if Insomniac gets this right, they won't just have another hit on their hands. They'll have something much more valuable, a character, a franchise, and a game that can stand on its own. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think about this game, because it looks very interesting, and I think there is a very interesting discussion happening about this game currently on the different social media platforms. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below, and take care everyone.